The Indian Contract 1872 Chapter 2 Unit 2 Consideration Learning Outcomes after studying this chapter, you will be able to understand the concept of consideration, its importance for a contract and its double aspects, how consideration may move from a third party, and how it makes the contract valid. A peculiar circumstances when a contract is valid even without consideration. The rule, the rule: a stranger to a contract cannot sue, and exceptions thereof. Unit overview. Consideration. Meaning and definition. Rules regarding valid consideration. Rules of no consideration, no contract. Doctrine of purity of contract with exception. Consideration is an essential element of a valid contract without which no simple promise will be enforceable. It is the term used in the sense of quite procure, that is, something in return, having a double aspect of a benefit to the promiser and a detriment to the promisee. It has to be really understood in the sense of some detriment has envisaged by English law. In this unit, we shall try to understand the concept of consideration and also the legal requirements of legal. We In this unit, we shall try to understand the concept of consideration and also the legal requirements regarding consideration. What is consideration? Consideration is the price agreed to be paid by the promisee for the obligation of the promiser. The word consideration was described in a very popular English case of Misa versus Purisi has a valuable consideration in the sense of law may consist either in some right, interest, profit, or benefit accruing to one party, or forbearance, detriment, loss, or responsibility given, suffered, or undertaken by the other. Section 2D defines consideration as follows: when at the desire of the promiser, the promisee or any other person has done or abstained from doing, or does or abstains from doing, or promises to do, or abstain from doing, or promises to do, or abstain from doing something. Such an act, such an act or abstinence, such an act or abstinence or promise is called consideration for the promise. Such an act or such an act or abstinence or promise is called consideration for the promise. Consideration is an act doing something. Ajay guarantees Bhuvan for payment of price of the goods which Bhuvan wanted to sell on 1 month credit to Chaitanya. Here, selling of goods on credit by Bhuvan to Chaitanya is a consideration for his promise. A college A college promises students who will score above 95% for the job in MNC. Consideration need not to be monetary. Here the promise for recruitment of candidate will be considered as consideration for the act of students scoring above 95%. Consideration is abstinence abstain from doing something. Abhishek promises Bharti not to not to file a suit against him if she would pay him 1 lakh rupees. Here abstinence on the part of Abhishek would constitute consideration against Bharti's payment of 1 lakh in favor of Abhishek. ABC has a shop of electronic items. XYZ wishes to open another electronic shop next to his shop. ABC offers 2 lakh rupees to XYZ for shifting the same away from 1 kilometer of ABC's shop. Here consideration is given for abstinence XYZ. Here consideration is given for abstaining XYZ from opening his shop nearby. Consideration must be at the desire of the promiser. Consideration may move from the promisee or any other person. Consideration may be past, present, or future. Thus, from above it can be concluded that consideration बराबर promise oblique performance that parties exchange with each other. From form of consideration बराबर some benefit, right or profit to one party oblique some detriment, loss or forbearance to the other. Legal rules regarding consideration. Valid consideration. Consideration must move at the desire of the promiser. Consideration must be offered by the promisee or the third party at the desire or request of the promiser. This implies written element of consideration. Contract of marriage in consideration of promise of settlement is enforceable. An act done at the desire of a third party is not a consideration. An act done at the desire of a third party is not a consideration. In Durga Prasad versus Baldev, Durga Prasad promised to pay Baldev defendant promised to pay plaintiff a certain commission on articles which would be sold through their agency in a market. Market was constructed by P by plaintiff at the desire of the collector and not at the desire of the defendant. Defendant was not bound to pay, as it was without consideration and hence void. D was not bound to pay, as it was without consideration and hence void. R thieves access goods from fire without being asked to do so. R cannot demand any reward for his services. Has the act being done voluntary? Has the act being done voluntary? Consideration may move from the promisee or any other person. In India, consideration may proceed from the promisee or any other person who is not a party to the contract. The definition of consideration has given in section 2D of the Indian Contract Acts makes that proposition clear. According to the definition, when at the desire of the promiser, the promisee or any other person does something, such act is consideration. In other words, there can be a stranger to a contract, but not a stranger to a contract. In other words, there can be a stranger to a contract, to a consideration, but not a stranger to a contract. An old lady, made a gift of her property to her daughter with a direction to pay a certain sum of money to the maternal uncle by way of annuity. On the same day, the daughter executed a writing in favor of the brother, arranging to pay annuity. The daughter did not, however, pay the annuity and the uncle sued to recover it. It was held that there was sufficient consideration. It was held that there was sufficient consideration for the uncle to recover the money from the daughter. The daughter did not, however, pay the annuity and the uncle sued to recover it. It was held that there was sufficient consideration for the uncle to recover the money from the daughter. Chenaiya versus Ramaiya, 1882. Executed and executory consideration. A consideration which consists in the performance of an act is said to be executed. When it consists in a promise, it is said to be executory. The promise by one party may be the consideration for an act by some other party and vice versa. The promise by one party may be the consideration for an act by some other party and vice versa. A pays 5,000 rupees to B and B promises to deliver to him a certain quantity of wheat within a month. In this case, A pays the amount, whereas B merely makes a promise. Therefore, the consideration paid by A is executed, and whereas the consideration promised by B is executory. Consideration may be past, present, or future. The word has done or abstained from doing, as contained in section 2D, are recognition of doctrine of past consideration. In order to support a promise, a past consideration must move by a previous request. It is a general principle that consideration is given and accepted in exchange for the promise. The consideration, if past, may be the motive but cannot be the real consideration of a subsequent promise. But in the event of the services being rendered in the past at the request or the desire of the promiser, the subsequent the promise subsequent promise is regarded as an admission that the past consideration was not gratuitous, gratuitous, gratuitous. He performed some services to be at his desire. After a week, B promises to compensate A for the work done by him. It is said to be past consideration and A can sue B for recovering the promised money. A case sale of goods is an example of present consideration. The consideration is immediately made against delivery of goods. Consideration need not be adequate. Consideration need not to be of any particular value. It need not be approximately of equal value with the promise for which it is exchanged, but it must be something which the law would regard as having some value. Something in return need not be equal to something given. It can be considered a bad bargain of the party. It may be noted in this context that explanation section 2 to section 25 states that an agreement to which the consent of the promiser is freely given is not void merely because the consideration is inadequate, but has an exception if it is shockingly less and the other party alleges that his consent was not free. Then this inadequate consideration can be taken as an evidence in support of this allegation. X promises to sell a house worth 60 lakhs or 10 lakhs only. The adequacy of the price in itself shall not render the transaction void unless the party pledges that transaction takes place under coercion, undue influence, or fraud. Performance of what one is legally bound to perform. The performance of an act by a person who is legally bound to perform the same cannot be consideration for a contract. Hence, a promise to pay money to a witness is void, for it is without consideration. Hence, such a contract is void. For want of consideration, similarly, an agreement by a client to pay to his counsel after the latter has been engaged a certain sum over and above the fee in the event of success of the case would be void, since it is without consideration. A promise to pay 2000 rupees to a doctor over the fees is invalid, as it is the duty of a doctor to give a treatment for his normal fees. But where a person promises to do more that he is legally bound to do, or such a promise, provided it is not opposed to public policy, is a good consideration. It should not be vague or uncertain. But where a person promises to do more that he is legally bound to do, or such a promise, provided it is provided it is not opposed to public policy, is a good consideration. It should not be vague or uncertain. Consideration must be real. Consideration must be real and not illusory. Consideration must be real and must not be illusory. It must be something to which the law attached some value. If it is legally or physically impossible, it is not considered valid consideration. A man promises to discover treasure by magic, bringing the dead person to life again. This transaction can be said to be void, as it is illusory. Consideration must not be unlawful, immoral, or opposed to public policy. Only presence of consideration is not sufficient. It must be lawful. Anything which is immoral or opposed to public policy also cannot be valued as valid consideration. ABC Limited promises to give job to Mr. X in a government bank against payment of 50,000 rupees is void, as the promise is opposed to public policy. Suit by a third party to a contract. Theft, though under the Indian Contract Act 1872, the consideration for an agreement may proceed from a third party. The third party cannot sue on contract. Only a person who is party to a contract can sue on it. Thus, the contract of stranger to consideration is a valid and is different from stranger to a contract. P whose is indebted to Q sells his property to R and R promises to pay off the debt amount to P. If R fails to pay, then in such situation Q has no right to sue, as R is a stranger to contract. The aforesaid rule, the debt stranger to a contract cannot sue, is known as a doctrine of privity of contract, is however subject to certain exceptions. In other words, even a stranger to a contract may enforce a claim in the following cases. First, in the case of trust, a beneficiary can enforce his right under the trust, though he was not a party to the contract between the shelter and the trustee. In the case of a family settlement, if the terms of the settlement are reduced into writing, the members of family who originally had not been parties to the settlement may enforce the agreement. Two brothers X and Y agreed to pay an allowance of 20,000 rupees to mother on partition of joint properties, but later they denied to abide by it, held their mother, although stranger to contract, can require their sons for such allowance in the court of law. In the case of certain marriage contract arrangements, a provision may be made for the benefit of a person. He may file the suit, though he is not a party to the agreement. Mr. X's wife deserted him for ill-treating her. Mr. X promised his wife's father, Mr. Puri, that he will treat her properly or else pay her monthly allowance, but she was again ill-treated by her husband, held she has all right to sue Mr. X against the contract made between Mr. X and Mr. Puri, even though she was a stranger to contract. In the case of assignment of a contract, when the benefit under a contract has been assigned, the assignee can enforce the contract, but such assignment should not involve any personal skill. Mr. Ankit Sharma has assigned his insurance policy to his son. Now son can claim even if he was not a party to contract. Acknowledgement of or estoppel, where the promiser by his conduct acknowledges himself as an agent of the third party, it would result into a binding obligation towards third party. If L gives to M to 20,000 rupees to be given to N, and M informs N that he is holding the money for him, but afterwards M refuses to pay the money, N will be entitled to recover the same from the former M. In the case of covenant running with the land, the person who purchases land with notice that the owner of land is bound by certain duties affecting land. The covenant affecting the land may be enforced by successor of the seller. One owner of the land having two land adjacent to each other. One was agricultural land. He sold he sold he sold the other land containing a condition that it can never be used for industrial purpose so as to protect the other agriculture land from pollution. Such a condition is attached with the land, so whosoever is the successor of land has to abide by it. Such are called restrictive covenants, and all successors are bound to it. Contract entered into through an agent. The principal can enforce the contracts entered by his agent where the agent has attached with the scope of his authority, has in the name of the principal. Prashant appoints Abhinav as his against agent to his house. Abhinav sells house to Tarun. Now Prashant has right to recover the price from Tarun. Contracts entered into through an agent. The principal can enforce the contracts entered by his agent where the agent has acted within the scope of his authority and in the name of principal. Prashant appoints Abhinav as his agent to sell his house. Abhinav sells house to Tarun. Now Prashant has right to recover the price from Tarun. Validity of an agreement without consideration. The general rule is that an agreement made The general rule is that an agreement made without consideration is void. Section 25 of the Indian Code 1872. In every valid contract, consideration is very important. A contract may only be enforceable when consideration is there. However, the Indian Contract Act contains certain exceptions to this rule. In the following cases, the agreement through made without consideration will be valid and enforceable. Natural love and affection conditions to be fulfilled under Section 5, Section 25 1. Section 25 subsection 1. It must be made out of natural love and affection between the parties. It must be made out of natural love and affection between the parties. Parties must stand in near relationship to each other. It must be in writing. It must also be registered under the law. A written and registered agreement based on natural love and affection between the parties standing in near relation to each other is enforceable even without consideration. A husband by a registered agreement promised to pay his earnings to his wife held the agreement tough without consideration was valid. A out of natural love and affection promises to give his newly wedded daughter-in-law a golden necklace worth 5 lakh rupees. A made the promise in writing and signed it and registered. The agreement is valid. Compensation for past voluntary services. A promise to compensate wholly or in part. A person who has already voluntarily done something for the promiser is enforceable under Section 25 subsection 2. In order that a promise to pay for the past voluntary services be binding, the following essential factors must exist. The services should have been rendered voluntarily. The services must have been rendered for the promiser. The promiser must be in existence at the time when services were rendered. The promiser must be in existence at the time when services were rendered. The promiser must have intended to compensate the promisee. The promiser must have intended to compensate the promisee. P finds Arce's wallets and gives him. R promises to give P 10,000 rupees. This is a valid contract. Mr. X had helped his nephew Mr. Y to fight a case in the court of law using his knowledge and intellect. After Mr. Y won the case, he promised Mr. X to pay rupees 10,000 held 10,000. Mr. X to pay rupees 10,000 held. This is a valid contract as it is compensation to past services. Promise to pay time barred debt, where a promise in writing signed by the person making it or by his authorized agent is made to pay a debt barred by limitation. It is valid without consideration. It is it is valid without consideration. Section 25 subsection 3. E is indebted to C for 60,000 rupees, but the debt is barred by limitation. Act. E sign a written promise now to pay 50,000 rupees in final settlement of the debt. This is a contract without consideration, but enforceable for 50,000 rupees only. A is indebted to C for 60,000 rupees, but the debt is barred by Limitation Act. A sign a written promise now to pay 50,000 rupees in final settlement of the debt. This is a contract without consideration, must enforceable for 50,000 rupees only. Agency. According to section 185 of the Indian Contract Act 1872, according to section 185 of the Indian Contract Act 1872, no consideration is necessary to create an agency. No consideration is necessary to create an agency. No consideration is necessary to create an agency. Completed gift. In case of completed gifts, the rule no consideration, no contract does not apply. Exception. Explanation 1 to section 25 states nothing in this section shall affect the validity as between the donor and donee of any gift actually made. Thus, gifts do not require any consideration. Completed gift. In case of completed gifts, the rule no consideration, no contract does not apply. Explanation 1 to section 25 states nothing in this section shall affect the validity as between the donor or donee of any gift actual made. Thus, gifts do not require any consideration. bailment, bailment. No consideration is required to affect the contract to bailment. Section 1 section 148 of the Indian Contract 1872 defines bailment as the delivery of goods from one person to another person for some purpose. The delivery is made upon a contract that post accomplishment of the purpose. The goods will either be returned or disposed of according to the direction of the person delivering them. No consideration is required to affect a contract of bailment. Charity. If a from Mr. A hand over the keys of his godown to Mr. Y, has Mr. Y had disposed his goods in the same, Mr. Y gets possession of godown, but not but not the ownership. As soon as Mr. Y lifts his goods from godown, he is to liable to liable to hand over the keys back to Mr. A. Charity. Charity. If a promisee undertakes the liability on the promise of the person to contribute to charity, there the contract shall be valid. Charity. 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 If a promisee undertakes the liability on the promise of the person to contribute to charity, there the contract shall be valid. Kedarnath versus Gauri Mohammed. Mr. Gauri Mohammed promised Mr. Kedarnath, the secretary of committee of temple, to donate rupees 1 lakh for renovation of that temple. On the faith of his promise, secretary has incurred some cost for renovation. Now secretary can claim from Mr. G even the contract was without consideration. Summary. The students may note that consideration is a price for the promise of the other party, and it may either be in the form of benefit or some determinant to the parties. Consideration must move at the desire of the promiser. It may be executed or executory. Past consideration is valid provided it moved the previous request of the promiser. It must not be something which the promiser is already legally bound to do. It may be moved from the promisee or any third party. Inadequacy of consideration is not relevant. Consideration may be legal. The general rule of law is no consideration, no contract. Must there are few exceptional cases where a contract, even tough without consideration, is valid. Stranger to a contract can't sue, but in some exceptional cases, the contract may be enforced by a person who is not a party to the contract. Stranger to a contract can't sue, but in some exception cases, the contract may be enforced by a person who is not a party to the contract. Consideration. Section 2D. When at the desire of the promiser, the promisee or any other person has done or abstained from doing something, such act or abstinence or promised is called a consideration for the promise. Legal rules regarding valid consideration. Move at the desire of the promiser. Move from the promisee or any other person. May be executed or executory. May be past, present, or future. Need not be adequate. Must be something which the promiser is not already bound to do. Must be real, not illusory. Must not be unlawful. Must not be immoral. Must not be opposed to public policy. Suit by a third party to any agreement. Trustee, family settlement, marriage contracts, assignment of contract, acknowledgement or estoppel, covenants running with land, agency. Contract is valid even without consideration in following situations: a written and registered agreement based on natural love and affection between near relatives, between the parties. A promise to pay for a past voluntary service is binding. A written promise to pay time barred debt. Agency, completed gift, bailment, completed gifts, bailment, charity. Descriptive questions. To form to form a valid contract, consideration must be adequate. Comment. Mr. Sohan Lal, consideration. The law provides that a contract should be supported by consideration. So long as consideration exists, The courts are not concerned to its adequacy, provided it is of some value. The adequacy of the consideration is for the party to consider at the time of making the agreement, not for the court when it is sought 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 to be enforced. Bolton versus Modern. Consideration must, however, be something to which the law attaches value, though thus it need not be equivalent equivalent in value to the promise made. According to exception to section 25 of the Indian Code 1872, an agreement to which the consent of the promiser is freely given in is not void merely because the consideration is inadequate, but the inadequacy of the consideration may be taken into account by the court in determining the question whether the consent of the promiser was freely given. Mr. Sohanlal sold 10 acres of his agricultural land to Mr. Mohanlal on 25 September 2022 for 25 lakh. The property papers mentioned a condition amongst other details that whosoever purchases the land is free to use 9 acres as per his choice, but the remaining 1 acre has to be allowed to be used by Mr. Chotelal, son of the seller, for carrying out farming or other activity of his choice. On 12 October 2022, Mr. Sohanlal died, leaving behind his son and wife. On 15 October 2022, purchaser started construction of an auditorium on the whole 10 acres of land and denied any land to the son. Now, Mr. Chotelal wants to file a case against the purchaser and get a suitable rendersal. Discuss the above in light of provisions of the Indian Code 1872 and decide upon Mr. Chotelal's plan of action. Problem has asked in question is based on the provision of the Indian Code 1872 has contained in section 2D of the Indian Code 1872 and on the principle privity of consideration. Consideration is one of the essential elements to make a contract valid, and it can flow from the promisee or any other person. In view of the clear language used in definition of consideration, In section 2D, it is not necessary that consideration should be furnished by the promisee only. A promise is enforceable if there is some consideration for it, and it is quite immaterial whether it moves from the promisee or any other person. The leading authority in the decision of the Chenaiya versus Ramaiya held that the consideration can legitimately move from a third party, and it is an accepted principle of law in India. In the given problem, Mr. Sohanlal has entered into a contract with Mr. Mohanlal, but Mr. Chotelal has not given any consideration to Mr. Mohanlal, but the consideration did flow from Mr. Sohanlal to Mr. Mohanlal on the behalf of Mr. Chotelal, and such consideration from the third party is sufficient to enforce the promise of Mr. Mohanlal to allow Mr. Chotelal to use 1 acre of land. Further, the deed of sale and the promise made by Mr. Mohanlal to Mr. Chotelal to allow the use of 1 acre of land were executed simultaneously and therefore they should be regarded as one transaction, and there was sufficient consideration for it. Moreover, it is provided in the law that in case covenant running with the land, where a person purchases land with notice that the owner of the land is bound by certain duties affecting land, the covenant affecting the land may be enforced by the successor of the seller. In such a case, the third party to a contract can file the suit although it has not moved the consideration. Hence, Mr. Chotelal is entitled to file a petition against Mr. Mohanlal for execution of contract. Hence, Mr. Chotelal is entitled to file a petition against Mr. Mohanlal for execution of contract.